I'm going to read the penultimate chapter of My Friend Walter by Michael Morpurgo. Chapter 10. I don't know where all the people came from, but every new street seemed to swell the crowd, so that by the time we approached the police station in the town centre, there must have been 100 people or more. Hump led the way, his lead dragging along behind him on the ground, and he was accompanied by a gang of ragged town dogs, all eager to share in the celebrations. Behind them came father, holding the golden orb in front of him in both hands. Will and I walked on either side of him, catching each other's eye from time to time, and each time confirming to each other that there was nothing we could do any more, that events had taken their own. Of course, we both understood, well, I did anyway, that our friend Walter had somehow set up the whole thing. Why else would he have been standing there behind that hedge and grinning like a Cheshire cat? It wasn't difficult to work out. After all, he knew we were coming that way. He must have been there when Auntie Ellie told us to go round the block, and he had just lain in wait for us. It was no accident that the orb had been lying under the hedgerow, because he put it there. And if that was so, and it was, then it meant that he'd had it all the time we'd been looking for it, or at any rate, he'd known all along where it was, and that meant he intended Hump to find it there. But why? What was he up to? I thought he wanted us to sell it and get the money to buy a new farm. That was his plan, wasn't it? That was what he told us anyway. I kept looking around to see if Walter was behind us, but if he was, I could not find him for the throng of people. The last I had seen of him was walking away through the trees on the other side of the fence, shaking his head and laughing. I ground my teeth. What's he up to? I'd have a thing or two to say to my friend Walter when I caught up with him. Still, at least the orb had been found, and at least no one would think we had stolen it. I mean, we'd hardly be handing it in to the police if we'd stolen it, would we? Then I thought of that whole charade up at the horrible Barrabills farmhouse, and how he'd frightened them half to death. It had been a game, to him, just a game. He must have known all the time it couldn't have been the orb in that sink. He must have done, because he already knew where it was, wherever that was. It made my blood boil to think how he'd fooled us all. I was still seething when we at last reached the police station. Someone had obviously warned them we were coming, for there were half a dozen policemen running out to meet us as we climbed up the steps. The crowds were held back and kept in the street whilst we were escorted into the police station. Hump tried to follow us, but was grabbed by the collar and turned away at the door. Father put that right at once. "You'd better let him in," he said. "It doesn't look much, but if it weren't for him, I wouldn't have found it." And so Hump padded into the police station alongside me, and we were ushered straight into an office. The policeman who was sitting at the other side of the desk looked at the orb and then back at us, and then back at the orb again. He couldn't quite take it in. We recognised each other at once. "Gracious me, it's Mr. Throckmorton again, isn't it?" he said. "Inspector Davidson, you remember? We met yesterday, didn't we?" Father nodded, and the inspector went on. "We seem to be meeting a lot lately. First there was the stolen horse that mysteriously came back on its own, then there was your little girl that came back on her own, and now this. You keep us quite busy, sir, don't you? I think you'd better put that thing down whilst I call headquarters. I have a feeling they'd like to hear about this. Sit down, sit down." And so we did, including Humph. "Now tell me, where did you find it?" And Father told him the whole story, which took some time because he left nothing out. The inspector shook his head throughout. "Incredible," he said, and when Father had finished, "Quite incredible. And you said there were witnesses?" "Witnesses?" said Father. "When your dog found it, Mr. Throckmorton, there were other people in the road, you said. They would have seen you then, wouldn't they? They would have seen you finding it?" "Of course," said Father. "There were several of them. I could see he was getting quite upset. Look here, Constable." "Inspector." "Beg your pardon. Look here, Inspector," Father went on. "If I say we found it in the hedge at the bottom of the road, then we found it in the hedge at the bottom of the road. I would hardly have brought it here if I hadn't found it, would I? I mean, I couldn't have, could I?" "Hardly," said the inspector, smiling. "But witnesses can help in these matters, you know. Put the record straight, so to speak. And particularly if there's—" He paused for some moments. "But perhaps you haven't heard, then?" "Heard what?" Father was bewildered. "We all were." "Well, I never. You haven't heard, have you?" And he chuckled to himself. "Oh, I'll tell you in just a minute, sir." He picked up the telephone. "But first I must phone the chief constable. Get me the chief constable, and double quick," he said, smiling at us. He put his hand over the mouthpiece. "You sure it's the real thing, Mr. Throckmorton?" he said, still chuckling. "I'm not an expert," said Father, "but it looks like it to me." "I don't suppose there's more than one of them about," said the inspector. "Chief constable," he spoke slightly differently now, more pompously. "Chief constable, it's Davidson here, sir. Davidson from Honiton. You're not going to believe this, sir, but we've found it. The golden orb, sir, the crown jewel." "Yes, sir. Yeah, it's sitting on my desk right in front of me." "Yes, sir, I'm quite sure." He leaned forward and examined the orb. "No damage so far as I can see, sir." No jewels missing. Don't think so anyway. It looks good as new to me, sir." "Who found it?" "It's a Mr. Throckmorton, sir." "Yes, sir. It's an unusual name, isn't it?" "Out walking with his dog, he was." "Lucky? Oh, I'll say so, sir. Trouble is, I've got half the town outside the station, sir. Newspapers are probably onto it already, and television. I need an armoured van and an escort to get it back to London, and more men. I need more men on the ground." He looked at his wristwatch. "Very well, sir. Yeah, I'll look after it until then." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And goodbye to you, sir." And he put the phone down, clasped his hands on his desk, and looked directly at us. "Well, Mr. Throckmorton, I think you are about to become a very famous person. You are all going to be more famous than you ever dreamed. If I'm not much mistaken, by tonight this town will be full of the world's press and television." Father was on his feet. "If it's all the same to you, Inspector, I think we'd better get home now. They'll be wondering what's happened to us. I mean, we were just taking the dog out for a 10-minute walk. Come on, you two, and bring Humph with you." Father bent over the golden orb and examined it fondly, almost as if he was saying goodbye to it. "Yeah, it's pretty, isn't it?" he said. "Weighs a bit too, I can tell you. So that's what £10 million looks like. Ah, well, easy come, easy go, as Gran says." And he laughed and patted it affectionately. We were almost out of the door when Inspector called us back. "Just a moment, Mr. Throckmorton," he said. "Can we find you at the farm if we want to?" "No, afraid not," said Father. "We moved out today. Be staying in town for a bit." "What address?" Inspector Davidson asked. Father thought for a bit and then looked at me for help. "Number 12, Huntley Gardens," I said. "Thing is, sir, we'll need to know where to find you." "Why's that?" "Well, it's like this, sir. I was about to tell you before I phoned headquarters. I was about to tell you about the reward." "Reward?" said Father. "Yes, Mr. Throckmorton. They've announced it this afternoon. There's a reward for any information leading to the recovery of the orb. I'd say it's highly likely you qualify for the reward, Mr. Throckmorton. You or your dog anyway, and it'll be a tidy sum, Mr. Throckmorton." "How tidy?" Father asked, swallowing hard. £250,000. £250,000? asked Father. "Yep, that's right, sir. £250,000, said the inspector. Father reached for a nearby chair and clutched it steady to himself. "Could I have a cup of tea?" he said. "I feel a bit weak." Will and I looked across at each other, and we both understood. I coughed twice, and then 4 times, but if Walter was in the room, he wasn't showing himself. "Walter, rally!" Will shouted suddenly, and he threw his arms round father's neck and hugged him. Of course, Humph began barking at that and chased his lead around and around until he pounced on it. "Pardon?" said the inspector. "Oh," Will recovered quickly. It's a sort of new swear word, instead of the ones you aren't allowed to say, when you're excited, Walter Raleigh! He got a nerve, my brother." "Oh, I see," said the inspector. "Walter Raleigh! Rather good, that. Walter Raleigh! Haven't heard that one before. Walter Raleigh! Yep, that rolls off the tongue. Walter Raleigh!" Father, said Will, pulling on his arm, "we can get ourselves our own farm now, can't we? It's what you've always wanted." "Oh, don't go counting your chickens," said father, and he looked up at the inspector. "So that's why you asked whether there were any witnesses, Inspector? I mean, if I'd stolen it myself, I'd know where to find it again, wouldn't I? And then I could claim the reward, couldn't I? I didn't steal it, Inspector." Father held up his hand. "Not guilty, Inspector. Scout's honour." "I didn't think you did, sir. Not really. After all, I was out at your place yesterday, the day of the robbery, looking for your daughter, wasn't I? I was there when your runaway daughter phoned, and I was there with you when you met her at the station. Course," and he looked right at me, "course she could have done it and brought it back with her from London." And the two of them heaved with laughter at the thought of it. I managed a thin smile, which was the best I could do under the circumstances. Will never even managed that much. We had a police car to drive us back to Auntie Ellie's, and it was just as well, because they had to clear a path through the crowd outside to get us through. The hero of the hour, Humph, sat between Will and me in the back seat, chewing his lead, oblivious to the cheering and clapping outside. I loved it, and so did Will. He couldn't stop giggling all the way back to Auntie Ellie's. And I will read the last bit sometime later.